What's up, everyone? Today's segment is going to be about the factors that led to the Haitian occupation in 1822. So, stuff that we are going to explain today in this segment, the factors that led to it was Spain abandoning the colony, immigration of the residents to the nearby islands, isolation and poverty, low population density, lack of a stable military force, the Spanish colony lacking funds, and an economic crisis. Some examples of this, which we are going to get into, are the Caribbean Sea being dangerous, too dangerous to travel to the island of Santo Domingo. The other factors that affected us was the depopulation events, the solar devastations, and third, another example, Spain ceding Santo Domingo to France in 1795. So, but first, I'm going to show you a quick book recommendation. Which I highly recommend, that I just found recently, Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology by David M. Buss. Very interesting book. Know that I'm very into science, anthropology, archaeology, all of those stuff. And then reading about this topic for over a year. I already have a couple of books on evolution, and there's one part that I want to show right here, which is very interesting. So check this out. This is figure 4.1 from volume 1, Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, and look at how it shows about the theory of the genus Homo migrating out of Africa. 3 phases it shows us here. Phase 1, modern human origins. Phase 2, population divergence. Phase 3, migration out of Africa. And then, check this out on the bottom. You see the diversity with sub-Saharan Africans. Then, as humanity branches out, Northeast Africa, Middle East, Europe, Asia, the Americas, Australia, Malaysia. Very, very interesting. So that's pretty much it, and let's get back to our program. All right, so we're back. So I'm going to be reading through some material and giving commentary. A lot of it you're going to find in Frank Moyapon's book, The Dominican Republic, A National History. First on the sugar mills in the 16th century. The sugar mills went into operation in 1520. By 1527, there were 25 sugar mills functioning at full capacity on the island. Of those, 23 were located in the vicinity of Santo Domingo, which was the only city with enough residents to invest in the construction of the sugar mills. Keep in mind, like after the end of the 16th century, the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, for the most part, Santo Domingo was in isolation, and most of the residents were living in poverty until the early 20th century when the Americans arrived. The sugar industry in Santo Domingo had collapsed and disappeared by 1586 after a series of epidemics had halved the slave population, leaving the shortage on the sugar mills. The island had fell into a state of poverty and neglect, which marked the idiosyncrasy of the Dominican Spanish Creoles who remained on the island. The decline of the sugar production was further exacerbated by the increasing competition from Brazilian sugar, and by 1581, which offered higher profits than sugar. The cultivation of ginger, like sugar, required a large labor force. Many slaves were moved from the Inmigrantes to the new ginger farms. So during the 30 Years' War, few sailors cared to venture into the island to seek products that could have been found elsewhere at a lesser risk. Remember, I mentioned earlier, the Caribbean Sea was very dangerous to sea travel. So because of this, a lot of ships avoided to go to Santo Domingo to get goods. And this also affected the residents from selling goods. This is one of the reasons why they resorted to contraband. The permanent lack of shipping facilities discouraged production as exporting became nearly impossible. The sugar mills in Santo Domingo gradually stopped producing, and the ginger farms were also abandoned. The slave population in Santo Domingo declined rapidly as imports of slaves long ceased by the end of the 16th century. By 1630, the slave population was insignificant, since most of the slaves had either died or fled to the mountains long before the devastations. For 3.5 centuries of the colonial domination, Spain had not been capable of developing commercial agriculture in Santo Domingo. This was due to the lack of money. The colonial administration could not function regularly. Spain, for various reasons, was also unable to send any subsidiaries to Santo Domingo. Right, and this would lead to reasonings for the brief independence that we had in 1821. And also another point that I want to make towards the end of this segment. The unstable international situation during those years further complicated matters. South American corsairs at the service of Simón Bolívar were sailing in the Dominican, Cuban, and Puerto Rican waters, disrupting Spanish navigation in the Caribbean. Spain was at war with France and England, and both the French and English corsairs were used by the governments to harm Spanish trade in the Indies. Corsairs confiscated ships full of cargoes, raided and burned plantations, and in general inspired fear on the island. These acts had a decisive effect on Hispaniola. The navigation to Hispaniola became expensive, with freight and insurance rates increasing as the international situation deteriorated. The isolation of Hispaniola was a serious blow to the island's economy and compounded the problems already posed by the Spanish monopoly in America. In the middle of the 16th century, as Spain became less frequent, European manufactured goods became more scarce. On many occasions, the colonists requested the abolition of the monopoly so they could sell their products to other nationals or to the other merchants at other Spanish ports. In all instances, the crown rejected these petitions. As the availability of imported goods decreased, the colonists resorted to contraband. So during this time, because the quality of life was so poor in Santo Domingo, they could not afford slaves. So because they could not sell goods, how can they afford slaves? You know, as the racial attitudes was more relaxed due to the unique condition of being developed or developing in isolation. So another example, when the depopulation, the order of depopulation was carried out, right, that ruined many of the residents' way of living. They weren't able to sell goods. The cattle that they abandoned, they were forced to abandon on the Western Third. So a lot of the residents in Santo Domingo were ruined because of those measures. And in another way, Spain didn't have no choice due to being in war at the time in Europe. and so wasn't the best decisions they had at the time due to the conditions. So another example here, Havana ports were used instead Havana ports was used instead of the ports in northern and western coast of Hispaniola. Arrival of ships became less frequent. Colonists gradually turned to French, English, and Portuguese smugglers. So in 1672, the economic activity of the entire colony had been reduced to subsistence farming due to the ruin of cocoa plants and the lack of transportation for the export of cattle hides. People decided themselves to making cassava, cultivating vegetables, hunting, and raising livestock. Poverty was so overwhelming that members of the Real Audiencia requested that the crown move the institution to Venezuela. A series of natural disasters had struck the island from 1666 through 1674. Ship owners avoided the island since it was well known that the inhabitants of Hispaniola did not have money. Poverty became so universal and so extreme that many families moved from the city of Santo Domingo to the countryside. The misery of Hispaniola was a direct result of the Spanish commercial system, particularly the marginalization of Santo Domingo from the trade routes. Having lost its economic importance, Santo Domingo was replaced by Cuba and Puerto Rico as the key points of Spanish defense in the Caribbean. Spain itself was economically spent and deeply involved in European affairs and could offer little aid beyond granting the Situado, the arrival of which was highly irregular. So basically, during these periods, the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you can see that Santo Domingo was pretty much to defend for itself. When war broke out between France and Spain in 1793, by October 18, 1795, Spain and France had signed the Treaty of Basel. Spain would have to cede and abandon to the French Republic all property of Santo Domingo to France. Spanish troops would have to promptly evacuate the towns, parts, and establishment, and would have to surrender to French troops when the French arrived. It was conceded that the inhabitants of Santo Domingo would have 1 year from the date of the treaty between Spain and France to relocate. The French had become the masters of the whole island of Hispaniola by means of the Basel Treaty, in which the Spanish colonists had no participation. The repercussions of the Basel Treaty were felt immediately, as many people quickly made plans to immigrate and leave Santo Domingo. So in 1795, the first group of immigrants was sent to Cuba, where the authorities said that they would be given lands equivalent to those abandoned in Santo Domingo. So when they were offered lands in Cuba, the lands that they were offered was inferior to the lands that they had in Santo Domingo. So they were pretty much offered second-hand land. The inhabitants were offered inferior lands. So in June 1796, approximately 1,800 people had left the island. The majority were military personnel with no economic stake in the colony. Many landowners choose to stay, especially after learning the fate of those who had immigrated to Cuba. Others requested the period of immigration to be extended to 3 or 4 years so they would not be forced to sell their holdings at low prices. Between January and February 1801, nearly 2,000 residents fled to Venezuela or other neighboring islands. The population of the Spanish part of the island, which had reached about 180,000 inhabitants by 1789, was reduced to less than half by 1809. In the 20 years, Santo Domingo not only lost its sense of national direction after being ceded to France, but also lost most of its educated elite and the colonial entrepreneurs who had been responsible for its economic revival during the second half of the 18th century. The most enterprising towns of the interior had been burned to ashes and had lost most of their population. All the clergy had left the island with the exception of about a dozen priests. The university was closed for several years. All of the converts remained closed for more than a century and lost their lands and properties forever. Exports were reduced to negligible quantities. Poverty again became universal, and a deep depression fell on the populace, composed mainly of the mixed people who perceived themselves as Hispanics, who felt abandoned by Spain. The 20 years had passed since the beginning of the French Revolution, and the 2 decades Santo Domingo underwent an ordeal of revolts, 2 Haitian invasions, massive immigration, a brief British occupation, and the total destruction of its cattle, all of which left Santo Domingo in economic ruin. So, closing out, Santo Domingo in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was mostly impoverished until the arrival of the Americans during the early 20th century, as I previously mentioned. The treaties of Ryswick of 1697, Aranjuez 1777, and Basel of 1795, Paris of 1814, they were agreements between Spain and France, who had their wars in Europe. So, 2 things I want to point out before I get into my closing remarks. What Pedro Santana did was based on what he knew best for his times during the conditions the island was during that period. What Trujillo did was based on what he knew, what he thought was best during those times. An example, after the Restoration War of 1865, the country was very unstable. So, final remarks. So, with this period, by 1822, the consciousness of the Dominican population at that time was split in half. You also see this after the Restoration War. And even to the present day, where those on the island and the diaspora, this is something I've been slowly building on, lack a collective consciousness, whatever that collective consciousness is going to be. So that's all for today. Like, comment, and share. Don't be reactionary. Put some thought into it. References will be linked down below. And until next time.